Long before Raw or SmackDown came along, television in WWE was saved for shows like Superstars, shows which mostly featured quick squash matches. So if you wanted to see those big main events then, you either had to attend your local house show or watch something like WrestleMania. But then something happened, as it would be in May of 1985 that Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol started running an all-new endeavor, a TV special which aired periodically on NBC and which would feature star versus star bouts on the regular. And it's this show we're going to be looking at right now, so join us as we take a deep dive into its entire legacy in the history of Saturday night's main event. It all starts, as we mentioned a moment ago, in the spring of 1985. This was when, seeing how much success WWF was having in the pop culture world following things like WrestleMania 1 and the MTV special The War to Settle the Score, then head of NBC Dick Ebersol met with Vince McMahon to discuss airing a pro wrestling event on his own network. Of course, if that was going to happen though, it couldn't be the same kind of content that was being put out on shows like Superstars. No, like with The War to Settle the Score, this show would have to feature big-time matches worthy of pay-per-view. Now, we should take a moment here to explain why this was such a novel thing during the mid-80s, as today the idea of stars showing up and having matches on TV every week is such a regular thing. Hell, it's not uncommon to see someone like a Cody Rhodes or a CM Punk have a title defense on either Raw or SmackDown. Back in the early days of the Golden Era, however, the wrestling business was built on a different foundation, as with this being before the era of big money TV deals which has seen WWE become so successful in 2026, the real money here was made on the house show circuit. Yes, selling tickets to live events was the primary driver of income in the pre-WrestleMania days. And so, whenever TV shows like Superstars aired, they'd mostly be used to build up matches which would later take place at live events. Following the success of WrestleMania 1 though, the game changed, and now TV executives could see the money there was to be made in getting those same fans to watch a big wrestling show on their network in large numbers instead. And thankfully, McMahon was happy to go along with that idea, as he knew getting his product on NBC would be a great way to reach an even bigger audience than before. So it was then that on May 11th of that year, in a time slot usually saved for reruns of Saturday Night Live, the first episode of Saturday Night's Main Event would air. And as was promised, this show would feature some marquee matches. What would some of these be? Well, aside from Wendy Richter defending her WWF Women's title against the Fabulous Moolah, Hulk Hogan would appear to put his own world title on the line against Cowboy Bob Orton. Needless to say then, this was a very big deal for fans, as it gave them access to the kind of bouts they'd never have seen on free television before. And NBC would be very happy with the show too as it happened, because Saturday Night's Main Event would score a pretty great 8.8 rating by the time all was said and done, with this making it a given that the concept would be repeated. That's right, very quickly now, an industry which had been built upon putting butts in seats in arenas was being forced to adapt to this new business model. But WWF, by now pretty much being the only game in town in North America, was in a perfect place to adapt to this change, as with many members of their roster now becoming household names, they were able to draw these TV audiences in and reap the financial rewards that came with that. Of course, it wasn't just the star versus star matches which made the first Saturday Night's Main Event a success though. No, these wouldn't have been nearly effective if there wasn't a strong overall presentation to the whole show as well. Luckily then, Saturday Night's Main Event had just this, as with Vince McMahon and Jesse the Body Ventura on commentary and the now iconic Obsession track being used as an intro song, the whole thing felt major league in every possible way. Really, the only question was, would the second edition be able to match the same levels of success, or would the novelty wear off after the initial episode? This was certainly a concern some in WWF had, but in the end, they needn't have been concerned because when the sequel happened on October 5th of that same year, it would be just as big of a hit. That said, it should have been, because not only would Hulk Hogan appear again here to defend his world title against Nikolai Volkov in a flag match, but viewers tuning in would also get to see Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff go one-on-one. The Dream Team put their tag team titles up for grabs against Lanny Poffo and Tony Garea, and Andre the Giant team up with Tony Atlas to defeat King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. Then of course there was the wedding ceremony of Uncle Elmer and Joyce Stasco, a shoot segment, and the first time a wedding had been done on WWF television. As you would expect then, the message here was clear. If you tuned in to Saturday night's main event in the future, you were not only going to see big-time matches given away on free TV, you were also going to get major segments which advanced key storylines. Yes, this was Monday Night Raw almost a decade before Monday Night Raw existed, and the third edition on November 2nd of 1985 would continue to prove that there was an audience hungry for a show like this, as that one drew another strong rating for NBC. What was the card for that show? Well, Hulk Hogan would appear again here, though this time he would not be defending his WWF title. No, instead he'd be teaming up with Andre the Giant to take on King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. That said, this would be more than enough to satisfy viewers, as just seeing the Hulkster wrestle on television at all was still a huge novelty back in 1985. That's right, even more so than the Macho Man Randy Savage's Intercontinental title defense against Tito Santana here, or the Terry Funk showdown against the Junkyard Dog, it was Terry Bollea who was the real draw of Saturday night's main event. And this meant he'd always have a featured role on the show whenever a new episode aired. Hell, as 1985 bled into 1986, there would be no one who wrestling fans were more interested in seeing on NBC. So when Saturday night's main event's 4th and 5th editions aired on January 4th and March 1st of the latter year, Hogan's WWF title defenses against Terry Funk and Don Morocco would continue to be the highest rated segments by far. Of course, you would expect these segments to always be the main event ones then, right? Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong, because often the Hulkster would appear in the first hour here, with the logic being that kids would get a better chance to watch him this way before they went to bed. That's right, like with shows such as Raw or Dynamite in 2025, the last hour of Saturday night's main event often didn't feature the biggest bouts. Still, for those who were staying up late enough to watch, some popular acts would be saved for these quarters. We are talking about acts like Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage here. And those segments would continue to feature major storyline progression, even if some of the children in the audience weren't able to stay up long enough to see it, with this being particularly true by the 5th edition of the show, as by then the build to WrestleMania 2 was happening. Clearly then, there was no stopping what Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol had created here. No, all it ever seemed to do was go from strength to strength, as with each passing month, WWF became that much more of a pop culture phenomenon. Seriously, by the time the 6th, 7th, and 8th iterations of Saturday night's main event happened on March 1st, May 3rd, and October 4th of 1986, it felt like this was an idea that might just go on forever. But then, how could it not feel that way when such iconic moments as Hulk Hogan debuting his Real American theme would happen here? And not just that, no, there were also very violent angles for the time period, like the time Jake Roberts DDT'd Ricky Steamboat onto the concrete floor outside of the ring and legitimately sent him to the emergency room. Would the momentum both WWF and NBC had built here be able to continue on into 1987? Absolutely, as in many ways, that year would prove to be the most successful yet, with the March 14th edition of the show drawing a whopping 11.6 rating, to this day the highest rating any show has ever done in that time slot on that channel. To put this in perspective, these days, episodes of SmackDown can expect to draw somewhere in the 0.26 range, a far cry from where we were back in the mid to late 80s. Sure, part of that is because TV is a very different animal now, and with cord cutting happening at an alarming rate, even the viewerships that Raw and Dynamite get today are pretty good when put in comparison to what shows like Raw and Nitro were getting in the 90s. That said, as Scott Steiner once famously said, the numbers don't lie, and even with more people having cable back in 1987, and there not being things like streaming services to siphon viewers away, what Saturday night's main event did here was hugely impressive. Really, they're a testament to just how hot the promotion was during the peaks of the golden era. So by now, seeing that this was the better business model going forward, Vince McMahon decided to give even more big matches away on the show rather than save them for the house show circuit, as he did when he had Hulk Hogan defend his WWF title against Paul Orndorff inside of a steel cage on Saturday night's Main Event 9. And when he wasn't doing that, he was airing things like lumberjack matches pitting the Macho Man against George the Animal Steele, that or interview segments between the Hulkster and Andre the Giant designed to hype up their big WrestleMania 3 showdown. Really, by the time Saturday night's Main Event 13 went on air on November 28th of 1987 live from a packed-out Seattle Center Coliseum, there was little the boss wasn't willing to blow off on television. Sure, pay-per-view would still feature the biggest matches, but by now, television was only a step below that in terms of overall importance. Think it couldn't get any bigger from here? Think again. Because not only would 1988 see the Mega Powers start to become a combined force on episodes of Saturday Night's Main Event, but the ongoing Hulk Hogan-Andre the Giant feud would also continue to be a hugely focused upon angle. So much focus would this get, in fact, after Andre attacked the Hulkster following his WWF title defense against King Kong Bundy on the January 2nd edition of the show that year, a spin-off would be created to contain the rematch of the century between the pair. Yes, it would be on February 5th, 1988 that Dick Ebersol gave Vince McMahon a second show on NBC, known simply as the Main Event. Obviously then, with this one being main evented by Hogan-Andre 2, the much anticipated second round from WrestleMania 3, it was expected that a very large audience would be tuning in. That said, no one could have predicted just how large an audience would be doing this, as in the end, a staggering 33 million fans watched on that evening as the Giant and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase executed a dastardly plan to get the WWF title off of Hulk Hogan through the use of plastic surgery and a crooked referee played by Earl Hebner. Really, the only other thing that gets numbers like this is the Super Bowl. So it should come as no surprise to learn that, even now in 2026, the Main Event holds the record for the largest TV audience any wrestling show has ever had. And while subsequent episodes of Saturday Night's Main Event throughout the remainder of 1988 would not be able to come anywhere close to those numbers, it would still continue to do very well overall, as in the lead up to and during aftermath of WrestleMania 4, fan interest remained at a high, especially when Randy Savage came out of that pay-per-view the new WWF champion. That's right, while he never got to defend the world title on pay-per-view during his first year-long run as champ, the Macho Man would get to make several big defenses on NBC, with some of the most notable of these being his bouts against One Man Gang and Andre the Giant. Even then though, the real star of the show remained Hulk Hogan, world title or no world title. And this was made clear when one of the rare editions of Saturday Night's Main Event he missed, the 16th episode, would score some of the lowest ratings for the concept overall. Not that they were bad, of course. No, WWF was still too hot and Randy Savage was far too popular for that to be the case. But it was clear that things were always that much stronger whenever Terry Bollea was there. And this was probably a big part of the reason why, in the lead up to WrestleMania 5, he'd once more become the #1 contender to the world title. That said, in doing so, he'd have to break the hearts of many fans because this would be where the Mega Powers would famously explode. Not that such a disaster would happen all at once, however. No, there would be plenty of teasing during the late months of 1988 and the early months of 1989 before the fall finally came. And one of the most notable of these teases would occur during the Saturday Night's Main Event 19 on January 4th of the latter year, the night where, as the Twin Towers of the Big Boss Man and Akeem were beating down the Hulkster in the middle of the ring, the Macho Man neglected to run in and save his partner, as he was more concerned with questioning Miss Elizabeth about his concerns that Hogan had lust in his eyes for the valet. Obviously then, it was only going to be a matter of time until things boiled over completely here. And that boiling over would eventually happen on the second edition of the Main Event on February 3rd, 1989, when Savage turned heel on the #1 contender to his title. Yes, once again, one of the biggest angles in WWF's history had happened on the Saturday Night's Main Event brand. Sure, the big blow-off would once more be saved for pay-per-view, with the Hogan-Savage one-on-one bout happening at WrestleMania 5 soon thereafter. But if you hadn't been watching the NBC specials in the lead-up to this, then you wouldn't have been anywhere near as invested in that blow-off as you would have missed out on so much of the story. Would Saturday Night's Main Event remain strong following the high watermark of the Mega Powers explosion? Yes, it would. In fact, all throughout the remainder of 1989, TV ratings for the show would continue to be high. And part of the reason for this was because now, with Terry Bollea in possession of the WWF title once more after he'd been able to dethrone the Macho Man at the Showcase of the Immortals, he could have further big defenses, just as he had during the early days of the show, this time against opponents such as the Big Boss Man, the Honky Tonk Man, and Ted DiBiase, all while the rest of the card was being rounded out by things like routinely excellent Brainbusters tag team title defenses, Rick Rude's run as Intercontinental Champion, and the rapid rise of a new superstar in the Ultimate Warrior. Unfortunately, though, as 1990 dawned, the first cracks in the armor of Saturday night's main event would show themselves, as while the January 27th edition that year did remain strong in terms of TV viewership. Once the Warrior beat Hulk Hogan for the WWF title at WrestleMania 6 in April, it almost immediately became clear things were cooling off. Why was that? Well, while he certainly was over with the audience, when it came down to it, Jim Hellwig just couldn't draw on the same level as the Hulkster. And as if that wasn't bad enough, even the former champ's star power was now starting to show the first signs of waning, as a portion of the fan base began getting a little tired of seeing the same old shtick they'd been watching from him since 1984. Sure, things wouldn't exactly crater here or anything, at least not right away. But like with WWE in 2001, there was a sense that the peak had come and gone, and now things were on a slow but sure downward trajectory. Hell, even big bouts like Hogan vs. Mr. Perfect and the Ultimate Warrior vs. Rick Rude inside of a steel cage for the WWF title couldn't do enough to paper over the cracks. And things only got worse once the company began a highly questionable angle in which Sergeant Slaughter became an Iraqi sympathizer right as the Gulf War was about to start, with all this leading to a situation where the April 27, 1991 edition of the show would be the last one which aired on NBC before it was canceled in favor of the NBA. Thankfully, though, this would not be the complete end of Saturday night's main event, as the Fox network, still seeing some value in it, would pick it up in January of 1992. But alas, despite getting a second chance here, it was not meant to be that the concept would survive for much longer. No, after only 2 episodes on this new network, Saturday night's main event would be dropped for a second time. And that, as it turned out, would be the last time it was heard of for almost 2.5 decades. As we all know now, though, it was not the last time it was heard of forever. No, it would be in 2006 that after Monday Night Raw returned to the USA Network, a network which was owned by the same conglomerate as NBC, NBC made a deal with Vince McMahon to bring back the once popular show from the 80s. That said, this time things were not going to be the same as they had been before, because by now Raw and SmackDown had long since made the idea of stars fighting on TV regularly a common occurrence. Hell, the idea that weekly television could be anything less than this felt like something which would have been outright rejected by the audience. So for that reason then, the concept of Saturday night's main event didn't have the same hook it had before. How would WWE counteract this in order to make it feel special for a mid-2000s audience? Well, not a lot as it happened. No, while there was some pomp and circumstance surrounding the debut episode of The Revival on March 18th of that year, it just didn't hit the way it had in prior decades. And the reason for this was because, while seeing main eventers like John Cena and Triple H team up to take on Kurt Angle, Rey Mysterio, and Randy Orton would have been novel back then, it wasn't so novel in 2006 when such matches could be found on Monday nights on a regular basis. Hell, even the pay-per-view level showdown of Shawn Michaels taking on Shane McMahon in a street fight couldn't do enough to give off the impression that this show was anything of particular note. As you would expect then, ratings reflected this sentiment, as while the 3.1 Saturday night's main event 32 received was decent for the time, it wasn't exactly blowaway in the same way that some episodes had been back in the 80s. And things would continue to fall in that respect as the Saturday night's main event 33 came around a few months later and scored a 2.6. Really, this one could be considered an outright disappointment, as the card was actually a lot more stacked here, what with it featuring a main event of John Cena and Edge doing battle over the WWE title in a ladder match and all. And not just this, no, on top of the closer, there was the newly revived D-Generation X making short work of the Spirit Squad too, as well as WWECW being present with a one-on-one bout between Sabu and Stevie Richards. Would things pick up again for subsequent episodes? No, unfortunately. Rather, Saturday night's main event would continue to slip into irrelevance as it became generally accepted among fans that it was a distant third in terms of importance behind Raw and SmackDown. So much would this be the case, in fact, even WWE would begin to stop going as hard when it came to booking it, with the June 2nd, 2007 episode seeing such lowlights as John Cena vs. the Great Khali, Finlay and Hornswoggle teaming up to take on the Boogeyman and Little Boogeyman, and Kane, Doink, and Eugene main eventing against Kevin Thorne, Viscera, and Umaga. Sure, when it came time for the episode after that on August 18th, there would be some attempt to do something of note again, with the big selling point here being Evander Holyfield having a worked boxing match against Matt Hardy. But that was largely seen as a pretty weak publicity stunt, and so it didn't bring in a lot of viewers. So it should come as little surprise to learn then that by the time 2008 came around, NBC was once more getting cold feet about keeping Saturday night's main event on a primetime slot on their network. And that led to the 36th episode of the show being make or break in many ways. Would it deliver? Well, no, would be the answer to that question, because while Edge main eventing against Jeff Hardy was something, other bouts like the Great Khali versus Jimmy Wang Yang left a lot to be desired, with all this leading to the show drawing a 1.4 rating. Yes, by now it was clear that the concept had run its course again, and once everyone accepted that, it would be a given that NBC was going to pull the plug, something they did after the show was over. So, like had happened all the way back in 1991, it felt like Saturday night's main event was gone forever. But like with before, this would not prove to be the end. No, for a second time, the concept would get a revival in 2004. Why the comeback at this point? Well, that had everything to do with the fact that SmackDown, fresh off of leaving Fox, had moved back to the USA Network, with this once more putting it in the same family as NBC. So it was then that as WWE was undergoing its biggest wave of popularity in decades, Saturday night's main event 37 would air on December 14th of that year. How would it do this time? Better. As while there was still the problem of the show no longer being as novel of a concept as it had been in the 80s, WWE were able to offset that somewhat by offering up a card that was less an episode of Raw and more a B-level pay-per-view. And we say that because it was here we'd get bouts like Liv Morgan defending her women's world title against Io Sky, Drew McIntyre and Sami Zayn having a grudge match, and Chelsea Green becoming the inaugural Women's United States Champion. Then, of course, there was the main event pitting Cody Rhodes and Kevin Owens against each other with the WWE title on the line. That and the reappearance of both Jesse Ventura on commentary and the original Obsession theme song. Basically, all of this is to say, what Triple H put out here was a much stronger effort than what Vince McMahon had done during the mid-2000s. Would this effort equal ratings, however? Yes and no, as it happened, because while these slightly under 2 million viewers they drew were decent for the time, they were about on par with the average episode of Raw, so nothing to write home about given the card that was on display here. That said, it was still seen as a win overall, enough to where NBC would be more than happy to continue on with more episodes as 2025 came around. And these would be big episodes for the most part, with the January 25th one seeing Gunther defend his World Heavyweight title against Jey Uso, all while elsewhere on the show, Braun Breaker was doing the same with his Intercontinental title while going one-on-one with Sheamus. Then of course there was the episode which followed that on May 24th. That one saw then World Heavyweight Champion Jey Uso put his gold on the line against Logan Paul. And if that wasn't enough to entice WWE fans to tune in, there was also John Cena and R-Truth going one-on-one, as well as Damian Priest beating Drew McIntyre inside a steel cage. As you would expect then, each of these shows did solid ratings for 2025. Sadly, however, this was where things would start to falter a little. Why was that? Well, because while it was billed as a huge event during the lead-up as a result of it featuring Bill Goldberg's in-ring retirement, Saturday night's main event would appear to fall below expectations, as Goldberg's retirement speech would be cut short while he was talking to the fans live. And it would also be around this time that the show would become a streaming exclusive on the Peacock app. That said, it would still be something valuable enough for WWE to keep putting out strong cards for. Hell, the November 1st edition would see 3 world title matches in Cody Rhodes vs. Drew McIntyre, Tiffany Stratton vs. Jade Cargill, and CM Punk vs. Jey Uso. And then of course there was Saturday night's main event 42, the show which came around on December 13th. That show would be completely unique as it featured the in-ring retirement of John Cena, WWE's biggest star since the Attitude Era. Obviously then, this was always going to be a big deal, and while the exact ratings are not known due to streaming services rarely releasing such data, based on the attendance of 19,000 alone, it's likely this show was a huge success. Hell, that's why it was such a smart move to use this one to highlight a lot of the up-and-coming stars in the undercard, We're talking about names like Javon Evans, Leon Slater, Obafemi, and Sol Ruca here. Of course, in the end though, the real draw was always going to be John Cena's last match against Gunther. And while the end of that bout might have been divisive to say the least, it left everyone with the sense that there was still juice left in the Saturday night's main event concept by the time it was all over. All that's left now then is to see where it will go in 2026 and beyond. As of the time of this video's recording, we already know the next episode will air on January 24th, and with it being held in Montreal, we'll likely see Sami Zayn play a big role. Aside from that though, it's largely guesswork as we all eagerly anticipate what's going to happen next. Will Saturday night's main event face the same fate it has twice before and eventually be pulled from the airways? Or will it continue to remain strong and go on for years to come? Possibly with more major moments happening on it as occurred during its original run in the 80s, or as has started to occur again in the latter half of 2025. That remains to be seen. One thing is for sure though, whatever the future holds for Saturday night's main event, its legacy is already secure as one of the most important shows in WWE's long history, as, were it not for it, we would have never gotten some of the more iconic moments in wrestling. And on top of that, who knows if we'd ever have gotten things like Raw and SmackDown, as in some ways they were only building on what was already created by Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol back in the 80s.